it's Kate from Minerva, and in this video I'm going to be showing you how I made this Liberty Bella tea dress. So I'm going to stand up so you can have a good look at the dress, and then we'll look at the pattern and the supplies. So here it is. I've started with a belt, and it really is a delightful summer dress. I'll turn around so you can see it. Okay. It is quite an involved sew, so this may be a bit of a longer video, but hopefully you'll pick up some tips and tricks to help you along the way. So let me show you the pattern. So you can buy this on paper and trace it, of course. So this is the model picture, and here are the line drawings. There's a couple of different views, and I'm wearing view B, which is the one with the collar option. It has a split at the front, which you then close up the top with the button and loop. And there are also darts in the sleeves. There's a sleeve facing, there's shoulder pads, there's a bust dart, there's a side zip and a 4-panel skirt. So there's quite a lot going on in the sewing, but I think the result is well worth it. In terms of supplies, it really depends on what view you want to make. And for view B, which is the one that I have, I've got a button here. So these are nice cream ones from Minerva that match the fabric. So that's to close the collar. And you'll need either snaps or a zip for the side. So you can get a plain zip like this, or if you're going to use snaps, then you'll need to get some bias binding and some snaps, so that's also an option. Personally, I like the zip one because it closes cleanly at the side, but you know, it's personal preference. And depending on how you want to finish the hem, you might want to get some seam tape, which is this one here. It is a curved edge, so there are so many different ways to hem, but if you want to do it in the way that is done in the instructions, which is what I've demonstrated, then seam tape is going to be very helpful to you too. For view B, if you choose to make the one with the collar, then you'll also need some interfacing. So I've tagged some lightweight interfacing, which I put in the collar for this one, and also for the facing at the front where the split is on the inside. You'll also need some shoulder pads, so there's a couple of options for that. So you can buy ready-made ones, so I've tagged those below, or you can make your own out of quilt batting and some lining. So I've demonstrated that in the video as well. Or you can have no shoulder pads at all. It's really up to you on that one. Fabric-wise, I've chose a Liberty Tana Lawn today to go with the Liberty pattern, and because it's such a classic summer design, I think a lightweight cotton works really well. Minerva have a really great range of Liberty fabrics, so be sure to check out all the different prints and things that are available. I've tagged the one I've used as well. If you didn't want to use cotton, then something like silk or viscose or linen I think would work equally well for this pattern. So the first thing I want to do is to take a look at the pattern pieces. And as you can see, there are quite a few of them. So depending on what view you're making, you'll need to follow the appropriate pieces here. And it's very helpful to also have a look at the cutting layout, particularly if you have a directional fabric like I do. So that means that you want one side to be facing up the whole time. So the cutting layout here is quite helpful in telling you which pieces you need to cut out and also how to lay them out. So now that we've done that, I've cut all my pieces out. The next thing I'm going to do is to look at the bodice. So here's my bodice. And the first thing I'm going to do is to make the bust darts on either side. Now, because my fabric is busy, I've actually marked where the point of my bust is just with a pin here. And I've got a couple of notches on the side to show me where they need to go. So to make a dart, all I do is I fold back the fabric and I match up the notches. So I fold the notches back on themselves like so. And then I look at where my pin is coming out. Which is here. And then I'm going to make a line of stitching from the notch to the pin, so it will be a small triangle like this. It's important to note that when you make a dart, once you've done your line of stitching, you stitch off the fabric and leave a long tail here. Don't try and backstitch here, otherwise you'll end up with a bump. So once you've left your long tail of stitching, you simply make a knot. So keep that knot as close to the fabric as possible, and then you trim. Okay, and there's one dart. And now in 99% of cases, you'll be pressing your dart downwards. So here's the armhole of my bodice, and I'm just going to press down. If you have a ham, this is a good time to get it out. So for example, like so, because then you can press this over the curve nicely, better than you can on a straight flat ironing board. So my darts on both sides are made and pressed, and now I'm going to turn my attention to the facing. So there is a split at the front and there is a facing piece here. You'll need to interface your facing piece. This pattern really doesn't require a lot of interfacing. There's just one piece for the collar and then this piece here. If you don't have any, I've also tagged some below, which is appropriate for this fabric, a lightweight cotton. And after I've interfaced, I've drawn in the stitching lines here, and I've also just folded it in by 1/4 inch, or about 5 millimeters on each side. So I'm going to stitch these down, and then we're going to put it onto the bodice. To determine where your facing needs to go, it will be dead center of the front neckline. It can also be useful just to take out your pattern piece and have a look at where it should go. So you can see that this stitch line here lines up to this stitch line here on the facing. So it should go like this. And we're going to make a line of stitching from here, stopping here to pivot and then going back up. Okay, so as I'm coming up to this point, I just wanted to show you how to pivot. So I'm going to stitch all the way up to this point. I'm going to lift our presser foot, spin it around with your needle still down, and then keep on sewing. So that's the piece stitched here, and I've also drawn a line in the middle, which is also marked on your pattern piece, because now we're going to cut along this line here, just about all the way to the point. So I'll take my scissors. I think a pair of small scissors is good here so that you don't risk snipping through your threads. So you want to go quite close. But obviously not through your stitching. Okay, and now we are going to understitch. So what that means is that we are going to flip over this piece of facing, and then we're going to stitch the facing to the seam allowances underneath, and we're going to go very close to the edge here, and that will help the facing not want to flip out once we've turned it around. So this is the understitching. It's just a line of stitching here, and now we're going to turn the facing over to the inside. So we just flip it over like so, and then you want to give it a press with an iron. If you find that you're getting a little bump here, then chances are you haven't snipped closely enough to your edge there. But I'm going to show you the back as well. And that's the facing done. So just to hold it in place, I'm just going to place a couple of little stitches. You can do this by hand or by machine, just with a small seam allowance here. So I've done some final preparatory stitches ahead of attaching the collar and the skirt. And the first set of stitches is the gathering stitches. So I've made 2 lines of gathering stitches within the seam allowance on the neckline, and there is a circle on your pattern to indicate where you should start and stop. So from the neckline to the notch, and then from the notch to the circle again. And then the instructions ask you to make a line of ease stitching, so that's just one line of stitching along the seam line, and leave long tails at either end, and this will help you when you attach the skirt. So next we're going to have a look at the two collar pieces. You'll need to interface one collar piece, and like I said, for this pattern you don't need a lot of interfacing, it's just for this collar piece and the facing that we just did. But I have tagged the lightweight interfacing that's suitable for this kind of fabric, and you can get that from Minerva as well as lots of other interfacings. So interface one, and then on the other one you'll need to do a little bit of different work. So you will stay stitch one line of stitching 13 millimeters from the edge that you can see here. So you go all the way around on the inner edge. And you may want to use a chalk and just mark on where the stitching is, because it's a curved edge and it will make it easier to see where you're going and you can stitch accurately. Once you've stitched that line, then you need to turn the seam allowance in 15 millimeters. So that's the, or 16 millimeters, that's the seam allowance of this, 1/2 inch. And then press it down. So you can see what I've done there. Now, you may find that because it's a curve, it might be a bit tight and doesn't want to kind of fold over. So in that case, just grab a pair of scissors and then just cut some snips in it to release the tension, like so. Probably more necessary on the curved section than this back bit, which is a bit straighter. So then the last thing you're going to do before putting them together is to trim down the seam allowance to 1 centimeter to avoid bulk. So I just need to do this like so, and then carry on all the way around. And then we are going to stack the collars on top of each other, right sides together. And we're going to join them together, so stitching all the way around the outside edge. So this is the collar once it's been stitched together, and I've used a 1.5 centimeter seam allowance, which is standard for this pattern. And what I've also done is just taken a pair of scissors and trimmed down a lot of this seam allowance here, particularly around the curvy edges. And that's because we are now going to turn it the right way out, and you might find that you get little bumps here because of the curvy edges. Another important thing to mention is that when you're doing your stitching, you want to start stitching the collar from this folded edge here. You want to leave this loose because this is now going to attach to the dress momentarily. So now we're going to turn it the right side out. And this is where it's helpful to have something like a point turner. So you could use a knitting needle, you could use an actual point turner. I've tagged one available at Minerva. And you want to use this to help you get the smoothest curved edge that you can and make sure that your seams are looking good here. So now, if you don't trim your seams, you can see that some of these bumps are just slightly uneven, and that's because of the excess fabric on the inside. So I'm just going to trim this a little more here. You can see where there's creases. Next, we're going to join the shoulders to the bodice. So you simply paste your bodice right side up and make sure that your gathering threads are all out of the way so you don't catch them by accident. And then you put the back bodice on top, right sides together, and simply pin and stitch this edge and this shoulder edge. So here's where I've seamed my shoulders. You can see that's the front, and I've overlocked it as well and then pressed it towards the back. If you don't have an overlocker, you can always use a zigzag or something like that on the on your sewing machine. It's just to stop your edges from fraying. Okay, so now we need to attach the collar to the neckline. And I'm going to show you this on the pattern because there's a few things that we need to mark. We're going to attach from the wrong side, by the way, so it's going to look like this, and we're going to pin like so. So I think the easiest way to show you where to pin is by looking at the pattern pieces. So this is the back and this is the front, and this is my collar piece. I've folded the paper as if this was my shoulder seam done on the fabric, and you can see that there's a couple of triangles which match up here. You've got a circle here and another circle here, and this is where you've put your gathering stitches, like so. So when you come to attach the collar, you also need to make sure you have all of these markings. So this triangle matches with the triangle here. This circle matches with the circle here. You've got a notch here which matches this notch, and the end of the collar matches here. So you can see that this is quite a bit longer, so you need to gather all this up and then make sure that the markings align on your fabric as well. So I just want to show you the pinning. So as I said, I've got the right side facing up, and I've got the collar with the interfaced side on the bottom here at the moment. And I have just pinned all the way around. I've also made marks on my fabric at the center back. So on the body of the garment and also on the collar, again, just to make sure that I'm 100% certain I know where I'm going. And then when it comes to gathering up these little pieces, you always need to pull from the bottom thread, the bobbin thread. Sometimes I do this in a different color to make my life a bit easier, because that is what will gather up the most easily without your threads breaking. Just pull on the bottom threads a bit. And then again, you might just need to adjust the gathers a little bit to make sure that they line up with the marks I outlined before. So for example, you could just use a little pin. You can, for example, at the ends particularly, just pull it up a little bit, for example. Okay. And then now we're going to make a line of stitching 1.5 centimeters from the raw edge all the way around. Make sure, of course, that you don't catch this piece here, the one with the folded edge. So now my collar is stitched on and I'm looking at the right side of the garment. So here's the center front. That's the split we made at the beginning. And you can see that the collar is stitched to the inside, like so. And what we're going to do now is to pull out the little gathering threads. So it's easiest to pull out the bottom threads rather than the top ones. Let me just do that now. Just pull them out. They should come out quite easily. They're only very short ones. Okay, so that's looking a bit tidier. And then we are going to turn our collar this way. So an iron is going to be helpful to you here, because we are going to tuck the seam allowance under this seam allowance, like so. I'm just going to put some pins here so that you can see what it's meant to look like. So for example, and this is the pre-pressed line you made on the collar before. Okay. So we're just going to pop that over the seam allowance, so just over the seam line that you've just made. And then we're going to do a slip stitch by hand all the way around the collar edge. So your final result will be like this. Okay, so I'm partway through stitching my collar down. So you can see I've put some pins there, and then it's just a plain slip stitch, nothing complicated. Now my stitches are about 3 millimeters apart, or maybe 2, but you can choose to do this whatever, suits your fancy. Some people like to have really close stitches and some people like to have ones that are far apart. So now we come to the sleeve piece, and there's quite a few markings and things that you want to be aware of on the pattern piece. So let me show you. First, we've got 4 darts up the top. We've got double notches for the back, a single notch at the front, and a couple more double notches and a single notch. And here is a pleat, so you need to fold this fabric into the center here to make that pleat. So let me do that on the fabric and I'll show you how it looks. The darts we make in exactly the same way as we did the bust dart. So here are the darts at the top of the sleeve. There's 4 there. And I've also put a couple of lines of what they call ease stitching because the volume in the sleeve head, which is what this is fuller than what's in the shoulder, and you need it to be able to set in your sleeve. So this is just 2 lines of basting stitches, the long stitch length within the seam allowance. With the pleat at the bottom, so the way I've done this is just to follow the markings on the pattern piece. So you fold one edge over to the middle like that and do the same on the other side. And then I've just basted it down with a few stitches here. And then the instructions ask you to make a line of stitching all the way around to secure the pleat in place. Here we have the pleat at the bottom of the sleeve, and all I've done is stitched from the bottom. I've pivoted like I did in the facing at the beginning, and then I've come back down. Now to complete the sleeve, we are simply going to fold the sleeve together. I'll pop a couple of pins in there. And we're going to stitch this with a 1.5 centimeter seam allowance and finish it with the overlocker. Now is the time to prepare the sleeve facing as well. So this is the finished one. And what you do is you take your sleeve piece, it's cut on the bias as you can see. You fold the short ends and stitch it together with a 1.5 centimeter seam allowance. You press that open and then you fold it in half and give it another press. So I'll open this out for you so you can see. So right sides together, stitch the long ends, short ends together, and then fold in half and give it a press. If you'd like to baste these together with a machine stitch, you can also do that as well, because we'll attach that to the sleeve next. Finished, overlocked and pressed towards the back. I'll know it's the back because there's a double notch on the edge here to show me that it's the back. And then we turn it the right side out. And then we are going to slide the sleeve facing over the sleeve. So you can find your seam and match that up with the lower seam here. Like so. Okay, so you just need to pin that all the way around and then stitch it with a 1.5 centimeter seam allowance. So now you can see that the facing is stitched on the outside of the sleeve. Now we're going to trim down this seam allowance to reduce the bulk. And so now you turn the sleeve facing over to the wrong side now that you've trimmed down the seam allowances. And then you're going to take a needle and thread and slip stitch all the way around to secure the facing. Now again, you could top stitch, but then you'll see it on the outside, so it's up to you what you would like to do. And then after that, you have a beautiful puff sleeve. I don't mind doing the hand stitching myself because it's just such a beautiful fabric to work with. Now we're going to look at the skirt, and because these skirt pieces are quite large and they look quite similar, I thought it's easier to show you on small pieces of paper how things are meant to look. So if we look at the front skirt pieces, there is on your pattern marked the center front, and also there's a single notch there. So we're going to join those together. So I'm pretending the pink lines are the right side of the fabric and the plain is the wrong side. So simply stitch and then overlock together this center front edge. I'll just put a piece of tape on so you can see what I mean. And then we do the same on the back, except the back is going to have a triple notch to show you where the center back is. And then again, you just seam and overlock that together. Because the pieces look quite similar, I found it helpful myself to just mark on the edge where the center front is. For example, I just wrote 12 center front, so I know that that's my front piece. center front. So it just makes it easier to figure out which edge is which on these pieces. So now we've joined center front and center back and overlocked those seams. We are going to join one side of the skirt. And if you were wearing the skirt, it would look like this. So we're going to seam together the side seam of the front and the back, just on one side. And for me, that's going to be the right-hand side of the skirt as if I was wearing it. So I'll just put a piece of tape there. So you can imagine that I have seamed it right sides together and overlocked it there. So that's the skirt pieces. Now we need to overlock the edge of the other side of the skirt, and we need to do that separately. So this is going to be my overlocking here. There's going to be my overlocking here. And it will all become clear as to why we do this in just a moment. And then we are going to join the skirt pieces from the circle marking on your pattern all the way down to the hem, like this. So if I was sewing it, I would put that together and then stitch down from the circle. So on the right side, it would look a bit like this. Let me just fold that in. Okay, that's the back, that's the front. And then you'll have a line of stitching from the circle, which is about here, all the way down. Okay, now we're going to finish preparing the bodice so that we can put the skirt onto the bodice. Turn it inside out, and you can see that on one side I have stitched the side seam together with a 1.5 centimeter seam allowance and then overlocked it together. So this is the right hand side of the garment if I was wearing it. And then on the other side, I have overlocked these two edges separately. And then I have stitched from just below the dart. So there is a circle on your pattern to show this. And I've stitched from here up till the top. And then now we're going to clip just below the dart. And so the seam allowance can go to the back. So I'm just going to, probably easiest to do it from a side where you can see the dart. Just a little clip to the seam, and then I'm going to press this to the back. And now I'm going to join the skirt pieces, and then we can insert the zip. So I've left it open, as you can see, because we are going to put in the zip. When it comes to joining pieces like bodice and skirt together, I always like to lay the pieces out as if they were going to be worn. So this is the bodice. And you can see that the side with the gap is over here. And then I'm going to look at my skirt and also figure out where the corresponding piece is going. So I've left my marking here to show me where the center front is. So I know this is the front of the dress. I can see that I've got a gap here, which is where the skirt is not joined front to back. So I know that that this edge matches with this edge here. Now, I'm going to think about this in terms of the way that I'm going to sew it. So it will be right sides together, like so. And then I'm going to pin all the way around. So first I start from the open edge here. And then I think I am going to match my side seam. And again, right sides together, like so. So this is just a rough pin for the moment, because now I know that I am going to turn my skirt inside out so that I can continue pinning along the bodice. So let me do that now. As you pin, you might notice that the front, particularly of the bodice, is a little bit longer than the skirt. Now, the good thing is that both of these edges are cut with a slight curve, which means that the edges are a bit stretchier and you can manipulate it a little bit. You can stretch this one out a little bit to meet the, to make it a similar length to the bodice. I think it's also helpful to just make yourself find the center front of the bodice and make a mark so that you can, so you know where that goes in terms of pinning. And this is also where your ease stitching at the beginning comes in handy. So at the bottom of the bodice, near the beginning, we made a line of stitching here, and now you can kind of just pull on it a bit. You see, like so. And it gathers up a bit. So whilst you don't want to have gathers in the join, what you can do is just to pull on it a little bit to make it sort of slightly smaller, and then you can manipulate the fabric a little bit so you can join it to the skirt without puckers. This is the same kind of thing that you would do for a sleeve, for example, but in a sleeve you'd probably use 2 lines of stitches. But basically you're easing it in gently rather than putting in gathers. So now I am joining the bodice to the skirt, and I'm just making this line of stitching. So let's look at easing. So when I stitch, you can see that my little line of ease stitching here, I've pulled on it a bit so it's crinkling up the fabric a bit. So all I'm doing is taking my pin and kind of manipulating the fabric of the bodice so it heads towards the back of where I'm sewing, rather, without creating any puckers, like so. And my line of stitching is literally just 1 millimeter away from the E-stitch edge. So I'm just going to keep going like this. This is not particularly quick, but if you want a nice pucker-free edge, then it's good to go slowly and make sure it works. So you can see I had a bit of a fold here, so again I'm just using my pin to manipulate it a bit. Here is the bodice. Now it's been joined to the skirt, and I have overlocked it and pressed it down towards the skirt. You will see that we still have a gap here, which is where we are now going to put in the zip. So this is going to be a lapped zip, so we can take a regular zip, and first thing we need to do is to stitch the top bits together so this piece doesn't kind of flap open. You can of course use an invisible zip on here, but since the instructions give a few options, first one is snaps, but personally I prefer a zip because then I don't have, you know, gaps between where my snaps are. So I'm going to use a zip today, and we're going to do a lapped zip, but like I said, you can also just use an invisible zip finish here. So for the lapped zip, I'm just going to take a needle and thread, check where the right side up is, and then put a few stitches in here to hold it all together. I'll zip my zip up a bit so I can see where I'm going. And it's literally just a case of making a few stitches here. I've done some pressing here of the gap where we're going to put in the zip. And on the front side, which you can see because it's got the dart there, this is a 1.5 centimeter seam allowance I've used here. And then on the back side, which is the side with no dart, I've used a 1 centimeter seam allowance. So I'm going to turn the skirt, the dress the right way round so that you can see what's going on in terms of construction of the zip. It's just a bit easier to see. So now my front is this side and my back is on this side. So let's have a look at the gap. We here are going to top stitch the zip, the right side of the zip to the back side. So here's the dart, you can see. Here's the back, and we're going to top stitch this. So we're going to first place the top of the zip close to where the opening is, and we're going to top stitch the zip to the back as close to the edge as possible here. So this is the side with the smaller seam allowance, because now when we come to the front, we want this to overlap the back. So just imagine for a moment that we've top stitched all the way down here, and close the zip a bit, and then we want this one to cover up the teeth of the zip. So this is going to go something like this, and then we're going to stitch all the way around the zip so that it covers, so that this piece actually covers the zip. Okay, so I'm going to go do it, but I just wanted to show you conceptually how it's going to work. So I'd say the easiest thing to do here is to use a zip foot. So you can see that I've put one on and mine's aligned very close, my needle is aligned very close to the edge here. And then you just use the edge of your foot as a guide to stitch. And of course you've got your pins as well. But that's why it's good to have pre-pressed your seam in, so that it's just a bit easier to see exactly where you're going. And then you stitch until the end of the zip. The other thing to note is that if your zip pull gets in the way, you can just lift your presser foot and zip it back up. So then it's just easier to get going without getting stuck on the bump. I also just wanted to show you where I'm ending the stitching. So here's the plastic stopper of the zip at the end. And you can see where my seam line actually starts here. So you can adjust this depending on the length of your zip as well. This is the zip that's been top stitched on one side now. You can see the top of the zip there. And now we are going to pin so that the front side overlaps the back and covers the zip teeth. So I would line it up because there's a waist seam here. So this is a good place to sort of check where it's going. So I'm just going to pop a few pins around. And then you can see at the top, we're also just going to pop a couple of pins here. And then we're going to stitch all the way around, making sure to catch both layers of fabric, so the top and then the one with the seam allowance underneath, because you don't want that to be flapping around either. So it might be helpful to grab some chalk and then just mark on there where you are going to stitch. And then at the corners, we're going to make a square sort of shape. So we're going to stitch along here and then go back there to secure the top, and the same on the bottom. I'm at the machine now, so you can see this is the zip and this is the front. I put some blue chalk marks where I'm going to start, and I'm just going to start on the corner here. I'm going to leave my needle down, press a foot up, and then pivot. And then you just keep going like this all the way to the top, and then pivot again and do the stitching that goes 90 degrees to the one we're doing here. So this is the finished zipper, and you can see that there's a line of stitching on the front side, there's the line of stitching on the back side, and the lap on the front covers the zipper teeth and the pull. And if you go to the bottom of where the zipper is, you can see the line of stitching that kind of goes around the corner here. To set the sleeve into the dress now, I have put 2 lines of gathering stitches on the top of the sleeve from the notches to the notches. And then I need to work out which is front and back. So there is a double notch to denote the back and a single notch to denote the front. So you just have to find which side you're going to put it on the dress. This is my dress here. And then I'm simply going to pin it together. So I can see that this is a front notch. So again, I like to lay things out in the way that they're going to go together when they're finished. So I just find the single notch and then I'm going to pin these two right sides together. Probably easiest if I go from the inside. And then I'm also going to match the underarm seam. And then the notches on the back. And carry on going all the way around. Now the sleeve head is always going to have more volume, and so the edge is going to be longer than the armhole edge on the body, which is why you need to have these little gathering threads so that you can ease it in the same way that we eased in the bodice. Here's a picture of the sleeve and where it's meant to go. So you can see that between the pleats, that's going to be on your shoulder edge. So there's also a circle marked on your pattern. So the shoulder seam is here. And pop a pin in. And then with the gathering, you can see these small lines here. Again, you just pull on the threads of the gathering threads so that you have like these little, the fabric crinkles up or ruffles up a bit. But again, you don't actually want puckers in your sleeve. But nevertheless, the gathering threads are still useful. So you can kind of adjust the amount of fabric, distribute the fabric evenly between the shoulder and these notches, and the gathering threads will help you do that. And then we stitch all the way around with a 1.5 centimeter seam allowance. The sleeve is in. You can see that the shoulder seam is in between pleats. And then I'm going to go through and overlock all the way around to seal the edge. There are optional shoulder pads as well, and you can buy either ready-made shoulder pads or you can make some with quilt batting and lining, which I'll show you as well. With your dress almost completed, it's time to try it on and then determine where you'd like the hem. The pattern gives a 6.5 centimeter hem allowance, but having tried mine on, I think I'm going to go for 5. So I've pressed it up by 5, you can see here, and then I've basted with a long stitch here, with a 5mm long stitch, just to hold the hem in place near the fold. There are many different ways to hem, so today I'm just going to go with the ones that are mentioned in the instruction, and they have you press up the fold, baste the hem together, and then put a line of stitching, also with the long stitch length, so I've used 5mm, because we're going to ease this in the same way that we eased in the sleeve and the bodice. And the reason is for doing this is because if you think about the circumference of the raw edge here, it's going to be longer than the circumference of the folded edge. So we need to keep that in somehow. So therefore you make these lines of stitches, or this one line of stitch, and then you can pull at the threads and gather it up a little bit. Now I'm going to put some steam on it with the iron, and then after that we are going to put seam tape on top and close it up. At the ironing board now, and you can see where the fabric has been gathered up slightly where I've pulled on the gathering threads, and then I'm just going to put steam on it. Just moving the camera out of the way, otherwise it will fog up. And so you can see when you press it, it goes fairly flat, even if you do get a couple of wrinkles at the top and it doesn't feel perfectly smooth. That's okay. Now I'm going to put the seam tape on. So I am first going to open this back out, and I'm going to place my seam tape just after this line of stitching, and then I'm going to sew it down with the machine here. When you get to the end, you can see that I've got a raw edge here. So I'm simply going to tuck under my end, my tail, like so. You can trim it down if you need to, and then just sew it on top. Then you need to attach the hem tape to the skirt. So you can do it in a couple of different ways. You can hand stitch it all the way around, but that's quite a lot of hand stitching for this dress. Or you can just machine it, so which is what I'm going to do now. I'm doing it by eye, but you could also use an edge stitch foot if you wanted to. And then keep going around like that. But just be aware, in this case, then you'll have a visible line of stitching. So that depends on whether you want to have that, depending on the fabric you're using. And here is how it will look when you finish the hem. So if you machine it, then, like I said, you'll see a line of stitching here. And then of course, don't forget to pull out your basting as well. Another finishing touch you might like to consider is if you want a button and loop closure here. So this is the collar, and it will just enable you to button this part up if that's what you like. Otherwise, you know, you can always wear your dress open. So I've sewed on a button here, and I'm just going to show you how to make a thread loop. So the first thing I'm going to do is to measure the button. This one is a cream color, and it's available in a packet from Minerva. So it's 15 millimeters. And then I'm going to figure out where that is on the other side. So I'm just going to line up the two collar points and then just put a small chalk mark where the top of the button is going. Next, I take my needle and thread, and I have threaded some top stitch thread through the eye of the needle. You can see there. And then I have just tied it in a knot at the bottom. So I'm working with 2 strands. Then I'm going to put it through my facing and just find my chalk mark so I know where to come out again. About there. Pull through, and then I'm going to measure 15 millimeters down. Just put chalk marks so I know again where I'm going. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to take a bit of this edge as you can see, and I want it to be a loop, so I want to give myself a little bit of space. So you can check that this loop is okay by, you know, putting your button through it and just seeing if it will go through. Okay. And you don't need it to be too tight. So I think I'm just going to tighten it a little bit and be about there. Okay, next I'm going to go back up to where I started. And again, just taking a little bit here. I'm going to keep my loop open with my finger. Okay, and you can check again if you think the loop is big enough. So I'm just going to pull it a bit so it's all 4 strings are the same length, and just check that this is going to be okay. Yep, I think it's going to be fine. Okay, and I'm going to go back down a 3rd time to this point here. And again, just making sure that this is the right length. Then I'm going to put a hem underneath it just to make my life a bit easier. And I'm going to pin these down so I know it's not going anywhere. And then I'm going to blanket stitch. So it's basically needle under here, just making a knot. Like so. And then I'm just going to repeat. So you can see why I've got the pins there. Just helps it a bit because you only have 2 fingers. Okay, I'll do that once more just to show you. And then you're going to keep going all the way up. Another option is to consider whether you want to have shoulder pads in your dress. If you do, then there's a few different options. You can, of course, buy ready-made shoulder pads like this. I've tagged some below from Minerva. Or if you follow the instructions, you can also make your own, which gives a bit of a softer effect. And this uses scraps of quilt batting. So if you are already a quilter, then I'm sure that you can find some scraps of batting. If not, I've also tagged some from Minerva, which you can buy. And we're going to make the shoulder pads and then cover them. So the cover, I think it would be nice to use something thin like a cotton lawn today, because this is what's going in the dress. It's also a cotton lawn, so you don't want anything too heavy. So with the quilt batting, there are different pattern pieces for each of these half circles, and you just cut them out. And then you lay them on top of each other, like so. I'm just doing this by eye. And you need to catch stitch all around the edges. So I'm going to show you how to do that. I'm using contrast thread for ease of vision. I've just got a single bit of thread, and then I'm picking it up the lower edge like so. And it's kind of a crisscross motion that I'm doing. So picking up on the underside and then crossing over onto the top side. And it doesn't need to be tight, okay? Just enough to hold it together. Okay, and you keep going all the way around. Now the reason I'm not machining this is because if you put stitches in there, you end up with really a hard line of stitching, which will indent the batting. So if you want it to remain soft, then it's a good idea to hand stitch it all the way, even if it does take a little while. Okay, so let's just assume for a second that I have hand stitched everything. So I'm just going to tie it off. Okay, so you continue in this manner for these other 2 pieces. And then there's a final pattern piece called shoulder pad, which is one big circle, and you put your quilt batting on it, and then you simply fold it over. So I think it's probably a good idea to fold over and then just mark where the halfway point is. And then you can put it along the fold line like so. And you might just need to adjust it because these layers are obviously a bit thick. So I'm just going to move that up a bit. Okay, so that the edges are matching. Now you've got a couple of options here. You can either use a piece of bias binding and close it up like so, or you can simply stitch it together and overlock. I think the overlock is going to be the simplest option, but it depends on how beautiful you want the edges of your shoulder pads to be. Okay, so I'm just going to pin this to hold the layers together, and then I'll show you the bias binding. This is a piece of double fold bias binding available from Minerva, so I've tagged that as well. And the first thing I'm going to do is to make a line of stitching along one of the folds, and I'm going to place it against the edge of the shoulder pad like this. Now at the end you will want to first open everything up and fold it in a little bit to make sure you don't have a raw seam there. I'm going to put it here. I'm going to pop a pin in and then stitch all the way around. So you see, this is the line of stitching, and then we're going to fold it over like so. And then on the back side, okay, there's a couple of ways you can do this. You can either fold it and stitch it like this, or you can open it out entirely and stitch it like so. So if you open it entirely, it's not really going to fray because it's cut on the bias. Just assume we're going to do that. That might be a bit easier. And then we stitch in the ditch from the top here. If you are stitching in the ditch, then a foot like this is really useful. It's got a piece of plastic in the center, and you can adjust your needle position so that it remains also in the center. And then you just follow the line of stitching, or follow the seam line. So you can see, for example, what it looks like here. To put in your shoulder pad, you need to try your dress on and then decide where you want it to go. So for example, if this is a ready-made one, but you want the thickest part, the straight edge, to be sitting on the shoulder side, on the sleeve side rather. So here's the sleeve and here's the body. And so you pop it in and try it on. And you want the edge of your shoulder pad, so that's this edge, to be about 1 centimeter beyond the armhole here. So this is the shoulder seam and this is the armhole. And then we're just going to tack it in certain spots by hand. I've popped some pins in where the shoulder pad's going. So like I said, you can see the straight edge of the shoulder pad is actually in the sleeve. And I've pinned in at the ends of the shoulder pads and also at the shoulder seam. So now I'm going to tack them in by hand. Got contrast needles so that you can see what I'm doing. Going to take the pin out. And it's a simple case of just making a few stitches. Making sure you catch the fabric underneath. But because this is a seam, I also don't want to go through the top layer. So just make sure that, so you can see my needle there, so that's not good. But I've got a seam here, so I just need to go through the seam allowance and not the main fabric. And again, just a couple of stitches here, just enough to hold it in place. It doesn't need to be, you don't need to have 10 stitches in here, it's just a couple's enough. Okay, so that's attached to the seam allowance here, and you do exactly the same for the shoulder. You can put, if the shoulder pad ends here, you can put a little tack there, and the same with the back as well. Okay. So that's it for this sew along. As you saw from the video, it was quite a long and involved sew with a lot of different techniques, but I think the end result is really beautiful. So thank you again for watching, and if you have any comments or questions, feel free to leave them below and we'll come back to you as quickly as possible. You can also follow Minerva for more tutorials and videos and inspiration. And of course, we also love to see your makes. So if you create an account on Minerva, you can also post your own creations and connect with other Minerva makers worldwide. So thank you again for watching, and I'll leave you with another little look at my dress just because it's beautiful and I love it, and I will see you next time. Thanks for watching.